Hi, so welcome back to Attraction Part 2. So, last time we talked about, the last thing we did was we had you decide which woman was associated with which man in the couples that we saw. And we asked what were the basis that you chose those things. So, we're going to get involved with a little bit more of those ideas in just a second. So, we're going to start with ideas of physical attractiveness. Physical attractiveness, it turns out, is pretty important. That is effective at predicting attraction, at least between humans. So I want to ask you, why do you think our culture is so obsessed with beauty and beautiful people? Well, there are three reasons that the academics have talked about. So one would be an evolutionary theory, the idea being that more physically attractive people tend to be healthier and therefore more successful at reproduction. In fact, the idea is that the things that make them more physically attractive are indications of their ability to successfully reproduce and therefore pass on your genes, et cetera, et cetera. There's another part of the theory that says that, well, maybe somebody who's physically attractive is just rewarding to look at, right? That just aesthetically, they're pleasing to look at. In the same way that it's rewarding to look at a sunset, right? It's just beautiful. And it's rewarding to look at somebody who is physically attractive as well. Another one is a cultural standard that we in our culture have started to connect the idea of beauty with goodness, right? So you remember when we talked about the balance theory, things that we want to be balanced should be balanced with each other? Well, if you are attracted to somebody physically, then you would want their other traits to be balanced. You would want them to also be a kind person, for example. You want them to be smart, for example, other things. In our culture, we've associated physical attractiveness with other good things. So, for example, in movies, traditionally, the bad person is often less physically attractive, right? Because we've associated ideas of physical attractiveness with goodness. Now, I'm not saying this is always the case, but these are some of the explanations that people give as to why we are so involved with the idea of beauty and beautiful people. When they do studies, they have found that physically attractive people are actually less likely to be found guilty in a court of law. So what they do is you take a bunch of people, you give them a court case, you take everything's exactly the same except that you put a photo of the defendant on top of the court case, and they're randomly assigned to either see an attractive person or an unattractive person. And even though the facts are all the same, if the photo of the person is more attractive, then people are likely to say, oh, that person's not guilty. What is more beautiful is people who are more beautiful are more likely to get an A. So just like with the court case, you give people a paper, right? An academic paper, and say, okay, this person wrote this paper, and the paper is exactly the same except for the photo that's on top. And people who saw an attractive person are more likely to give that paper a better score. People who are more beautiful tend to be more likely to get elected. People they also tend to be seen as more sociable, more extroverted, more popular, more successful, and more assertive. They are perceived to be these things, at least. And in certain cases, they actually do end up being that way. So, for example, somebody who is physically more attractive is more likely to be sociable. And one explanation for that is to say that physically attractive people are often interacted with in a positive way. People are more likely to approach them in a positive manner. Well, they're likely to associate those interactions with positive responses and therefore learn social skills at a more rapid rate and in more in depth than somebody who might be less attractive. Sexually happier. Well, it is true that people who are physically more attractive tend to be more sexually experienced and they're perceived to be sexually happier. But what's interesting is when we need to talk about with ideas of self-esteem. There's at least one study that finds that people who are physically attractive really don't have they don't differ a lot in their self-esteem. Now, part of the reason why is because it seems, at least, that people who are physically attractive often learn that people interact positively with them because of their physical attractiveness, not because of other qualities that they would like to be recognized. So, for example, there's a famous study where where physically attractive people who were pre-rated as physically attractive were asked to interact with somebody either over the phone or face to face. And what they found is that people who were physically attractive did not believe the feedback that they got when they were presenting a project, for example, when they were meeting face to face. They did believe it when it was over the phone. People who were less attractive didn't matter if it was over the phone or face to face. The idea being that some people who are more physically attractive learn that sometimes they get positive feedback because of the way they look, not because of the quality of their work, for example. So that's when we get to the idea of, is it ever bad to be physically attractive? Now, admittedly, that's not particularly bad, by the way, but that is an example of how it may lead people to not believe positive feedback, at least not face to face. So let's talk about ideas of what makes somebody physically attractive. So why don't I ask you, what is beautiful? What is physically attractive in your eyes? All right. We need to talk about things that are different universally compared to culturally. So there's some evidence that there are some things that are just kind of universally more attractive. And there is some evidence that some things are just that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? That physical attractiveness only is in this particular context or in this culture. So let's talk about ideas of universal attractiveness. With that, let's take a look at this, and I want you to tell me which of these women is most attractive. Well, when we ask this question, a lot of people are going to give C as the answer. This is actually a composite. All of these are composite photos. And all of these have the same women in them, and then they added more women to the photos for B and more women for C. And what they found is that when you composite a lot of people's photos together, the more composites, the more attractive. So what does that mean? Why do I care? Well, let me kind of go back here. The universal attraction involves the idea that people who are physically more attractive tend to be more healthy. So some people believe that the reason why composite faces are more attractive is because they're more likely to get rid of any abnormalities that might be in the face. Okay? So for example, we know that people who have more symmetrical faces tend to be seen as more attractive. And the idea is that if you have a symmetrical face, you're more likely to be healthier, right? People with asymmetrical faces, that might be because of a physical limitation that might have happened, right? And therefore people with symmetrical faces are seen as more attractive. Well, the idea here is the more that you composite the faces, the more likely that person to have blemishes or asymmetries, that's going to be washed out by the composites of everybody's faces, and therefore that person is more abnormally attractive because they have fewer defects in their facial features. Some people believe that that's not the case, though, that the composites are actually because of mere exposure effect. That when you see a composite of a lot of faces, it becomes like an aggregate of what you see day to day, right? And that aggregate is attractive because that's what you're exposed to more regularly. I personally think it's probably the defects explanation instead of mere exposure, but that's true. When we look at other ideas of what is universally attractive and what is not, so it kind of depends on the sex of the person that we're talking about. So, for example, universally, women tend to be rated as more attractive if they have longer hair. Meaning, when I say universally, I mean across cultures, women with longer hair are rated more attractive than women with shorter hair. Ideas of waist to hip ratio. So overall, it's not a matter of skinniness, it's a matter of waist to hip ratio. So for women, that's about 65%, right? Your waist is about 65% the circumference of your hips. For men, on the other hand, that is 90%, right? That 90% of your waist is 90% of the circumference of your hips. And those are universal. Evidence that beauty depends on culture includes things like weight. So, for example, being skinny is not universally seen as more attractive. Waist to hip ratio, that is, but skinniness is not. I did some work in Mozambique during and before grad school. And so I'd been there several times, and I'd walked down this particular street several times, and and it was fine. It was interesting. But one time I took my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law, married to my sister. He's a large man, right? He's he's over 200 pounds. He's a videographer, so he went along with me. And I'd walked down this street before, but when I walked down the street with him, we got catcalls. Women were coming out to see him. He doesn't speak Portuguese, but I do. And so they would be calling at him and say, "Hey, do you have a wife?" And I would answer for him because he didn't understand what they were saying. I said, "Yeah, he does. It's my sister." And they'd say, "Well, does he have a wife here?" So he was seen as much more attractive in Mozambican culture because he was larger, right? Physical attractiveness in that culture includes when you're larger, you're more physically attractive, right? So there's other things as well. That includes different fashions and different things. Even something like bust size has changed over time, right? In the 1920s, it was much more attractive for women to have a flat chest compared to a more voluptuous chest, right? Those things tend to be more culturally specific, but things that are universal include things like waist to hip ratio, symmetry, fewer blemishes, etc. All right. Tell me the last digit of your phone number. All right. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell me how attractive you think you are on a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 being unattractive and 7 being extremely attractive. All right. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell me on a scale from 1 to 7, how attractive are you? So I want you to rate yourself on your own attractiveness from 1 to 7, with 1 being unattractive and 7 being extremely attractive. Okay, so the reason why I had you give me your phone number is because half of you saw this photo when you answered that question, and half saw this photo. So what we need to talk about is the contrast effect. Generally, when we rate our own attraction, our own attractiveness, there's a contrast. It depends on who we're comparing ourselves to. So the contrast effect is a perceptual precursor to social comparison theory. These are like the same ideas. When you compare yourself to someone who is very attractive, then you consider yourself less attractive. When you compare yourself to someone who is less attractive, you consider yourself more attractive. So physical attractiveness, even though it is based on some universal and cultural, characteristics, also depends on the situation that you're in, meaning who you're comparing yourself to, who you're contrasting yourself with. What does this mean for something like the media? Well, one important point on this is that often when you're comparing yourself with like a fashion magazine, you're not comparing yourself to a real person. You're comparing yourself to an airbrushed representation of someone, which is relatively unattainable. So they're probably attractive to begin with, but even more so because of the way that they have been represented in the media. This often leads to upward social comparison, and studies have found that people feel less attractive when they're reading a fashion magazine, for example. Well, what does this mean for something like pornography? Conversely, there's at least one study that found that men, so in this case, they got heterosexual men to be in the study, and they were all in a serious relationship. They had the men, half the men watch pornography and half not watch pornography. And then afterwards, they asked how satisfied they were with their current relationship partner. And they found that the men who had watched pornography were less satisfied, at least in an attraction sexual way, than the men who did not view pornography. The idea being is that they are using a different comparison. They're contrasting their expectations with a different standard than they would in real life. So we need to talk about physical attractiveness in terms of matching. So what we're going to talk about now is called the matching hypothesis. The matching hypothesis says that somebody is more desirable based off of how physically attractive they are. So if somebody's physical attractiveness is a 9, then they're going to be more desirable than somebody who is a 2, right? Desirability is based on physical attractiveness. But the matching hypothesis says it's not just physical attractiveness by itself. It's physical attractiveness by the probability of acceptance. And what this means is that in real life, people tend to end up with somebody who is roughly the same in their own physical attractiveness. So 8s end up with 8s, 5s end up with 5s, 3s end up with 3s, etc. Is that because somebody who is less attractive doesn't find somebody who's an 8 to be more attractive? No. Instead, what's going on is that person is physically attractive, but they're less likely to accept the other person as a relationship partner. So what happens is, essentially what's going on is people kind of check out what's going on with you go to in a room full of people, right, potential partners. You're looking around and saying, well, my attractiveness is here. I'm attracted to these people, but I'm less likely to have that because there's other people who are more attractive than me. And then you kind of go down the list and end up with somebody who's roughly the same physical attractiveness because that's the person who's most likely to accept you. Now, are there ever any exceptions to this? Well, yeah, of course there are. There are other things besides physical attractiveness that influence the probability of acceptance. And so we're going to get to that in just a second. So let's talk about, I'm going to just move ahead, and then we'll get back to this idea. Sometimes, for example, a very physically attractive woman might end up with a man who is less physically attractive. Well, matching hypothesis would say that this is based off of something called mate value. That if people value something like money or wealth or status, then that would make them more attractive. So, for example, when you look at the matching hypothesis, the physical attractiveness is part of it, but the probability of acceptance changes depending on other factors like how much cash he has, right? So that might explain why somebody who is a billionaire might have a very attractive spouse when they themselves are not particularly physically attractive. That's the matching hypothesis. But in general, people end up with someone who's very similar in their attractiveness level. Okay, so which one is true? Birds of a feather flock together or opposites attract? Which is correct? Of course, it's birds of a feather flock together. The more similar you are, the more attracted you are in general. So when I'm talking about similarity, I'm talking about similarity in demographics, attitudes and values, physical attractiveness, personalities. We already saw that with the matching hypothesis, right? The people who are more physically attractive, similar in physical attractiveness, tend to end up together because of the probability of acceptance. Remember when you did the pairings, right? When you had to choose whose boyfriend was whose? You were probably looking for similarities on a lot of different things. Similarity in demographic, including, dare I say it, similarity in things like race, age, other personality traits you're trying to determine, right? In general, people are more likely to end up with somebody who's more similar on a variety of things. So we need to talk about ideas of perceptions of similarity, right? So a lot of this is based off of ideas of perceived similarity versus unperceived similarity. So for example, some of you are saying, wait a minute, my parents are so opposite from each other. They're just like not the same at all. They're just not even close to the same. So you're wrong because opposites attracted there. Well, if I were to look at your parents, having not grown up with them, comparing them to other people, other couples that I've seen in the world, I would more likely than not probably see them as quite similar. And you're like, no, they're really different. But you probably understand the differences because you are intimately aware of any differences in their personalities, and you're probably not thinking a lot about some of the similarities that they have, right? Similarities that may include certain values, right? Like perhaps one of the values that they share is, raising children, or education, or other things like that that you don't even realize are shared similarities. Now, we need to talk about stimulus value role theory, because stimulus value role theory is going to show us that it's not just like everybody who's most similar is going to end up together. It depends on several different things. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to draw this out, and we're going to talk about stimulus value role theory. So what we're going to show you here is the y-axis is going to be attraction. Okay? The x-axis is going to be time. All right? Now, let's see if I can change a color here. So I'm going to start with green. Green is going to be stimulus. I'm going to draw 3 separate lines, one for stimulus, one for value, and one for role. So green is stimulus. Stimulus means physical attraction. And what we find is that at the beginning of relationships, physical attractiveness is very, 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 very important, right? It's quite important. Now, it doesn't go to 0 over time in its importance. So the amount of attraction or importance that we see on the y-axis, it's going down, but it's going to flatten out. There's other things that are important besides just how physically attractive someone is. So for example, this orange line is going to be value. Value means shared values, okay? Things that are important to you. At the beginning of a relationship, stimulus tends to be more important. Then over time in the relationship, shared values becomes more important. So let's just write that down. Let's see if I can get this pen to work. Value, right? Values. And then finally, whoops, I better use a different color. The last one is role, meaning shared roles. Okay? And what this is saying is that over time, the importance of each and what you're attracted to will change, right? Not that the one's going to go away, but the priority of what's important is going to switch over time. At the beginning of a relationship, physical stimulus, meaning physical and sexual attraction, tends to be more important in a relationship. It doesn't go to 0 over time, but it becomes less important over time compared to shared values. And then over time, as the relationship becomes established, the roles that you play in each other's life becomes more important than either stimulus or values. Stimulus value role theory says the importance changes over time based off of where you are in your relationship. All right. We saw this slide before, but we need to talk about, do opposites ever attract? Now, you may say, like we saw in mate value, that sometimes somebody who is very different physically might be attractive. Well, that's probably because there's other things that make them desirable, like money. A fatal attraction means that sometimes you're attracted to something that over time becomes onerous to you. Remember when we talked about social allergy? It's kind of like that. So for example, maybe you're initially attracted to somebody because they're very impulsive, right? And so spontaneous. But then over time, you get pretty bored of somebody who just spontaneously does whatever they want. You can't trust them to be there at any given time, right? That becomes what we call a fatal attraction. Ideal selves, if you remember, we talked about ideas of self, right? We have ought selves, actual selves, and ideal selves. Well, sometimes people are attracted to somebody who has traits that represent their ideal selves. Now, that can be problematic, though, if the person can't also get that trait. So, for example, if my wife, if I idealize the idea of, I don't know, maybe I got to think of something. Ability to be a good entrepreneur, right? Idealize, I want that. And she has that skill and I don't. Well, if I also become a good entrepreneur with her help, then that would be fine, right? But if I can't do that, then it can lead to feelings of not feeling comfortable in the relationship because that person has something that you don't. Complementarity means that sometimes there are certain traits that complement each other. Excuse me. So, for example, one that was often talked about is somebody who is particularly submissive compared to somebody who's authoritarian. Now, there are some instances where people have found that there are those traits that seem to complement each other, but even those can lead to conflict over time because people don't have a lot in common sometimes. So, for example, somebody who is very stereotypically masculine, you might think would be really complementary with somebody who's very stereotypically feminine. But what we find is that that's actually not really true. People who are stereotypically masculine, high instrumentality is what we call that, tend to not be very compatible because they don't have a lot in common with somebody who is high expressive, which is stereotypically feminine in their relationship. All right. We need to talk about reactants. Sometimes when we discuss this idea of do opposites attract, we get the Romeo and Juliet effect, which means that sometimes people find the other person attractive because of reactants. If you remember, reactants is when we feel like our control is taken away. So if I'm a Romeo and I'm told that I can't date anyone from that family, I can't remember if Romeo's Capulet or not. Anyway, I can't date anyone from that family, then me having that control taken away from me can make me react against that and want to do that because I feel like my control is taken away. And I'm saying, hey, you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to go date her anyway. All right. Matchmaking can have this happen. I don't know if you've ever been set up with somebody, but being set up on a date kind of takes away some of the control, at least perceivedly, and might make you react against it, saying, hey, you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to react against that particular idea. There is one last thing I want to talk about, and even though this is the last of the slideshow, there are 3 universal things that everybody finds attractive. Okay, 3 universal things that everybody finds attractive. Okay, they are physical attractiveness and vitality, right? So everybody universally finds physical things attractive, like the symmetry, that kind of stuff we're talking about. Status and resources is another. So status and resources are attractive. When people have wealth, that is attractive to others. And the other is emotional caring and intimacy, right? All 3 of these things are valued by everyone and they cause attraction. Now, sometimes the priority of which one is most attractive might be different. Somebody might find physical attractiveness more important than status and resources, right? Which is more important than, intimacy and compassion. Some people might switch that around, where they find intimacy and compassion the most important, then status and resources, and then physical attractiveness. So the priorities of which is most attractive can change, right? They can be different. But all of those things tend to be attractive for everyone. So don't let somebody say, hey, well, that person only cares about who's hot and who's not. That person never cares about their personality, because that's not really true. Their priority might be a little bit different than yours, the hierarchy of the list, but all people find those things generally attractive. All right, thanks, everybody.